The Cannabis Heals Me podcast, episode 97.
You're listening to the Cannabis Heals Me podcast, where we explore the real stories of real people who have discovered the profound healing properties of the cannabis plant in their own lives. Find more at cannabis-heals-me.com.
Welcome back, everyone, to the Cannabis Heals Me podcast. I am your host, Rachel Kennerly, and we are 3 short episodes, well, maybe not so short, but we are 3 episodes away from our epic 100th episode of the Cannabis Heals Me podcast. I don't know about y'all, but 100 is a number that just makes me squeal like a little girl. So I'm really excited about it. Like I said, I've already recorded the episode, so you guys are going to have to tune in to episode 100 to hear what we're talking about that day. Thank you once again for tuning in. We really appreciate all of our listeners who have come to make this podcast as successful as it is. Our downloads are continuing to grow. We are seeing an increase in the number of people stopping by. We're getting more traffic. We're getting more people that are giving us feedback on the shows. We really appreciate all of you who have come back time and time again to listen. We also really appreciate you guys sharing the show with your friends and family and not so loved ones. It's really making a difference, and we really appreciate that. What we ask you to do each week, if you're new to the show, is tell 3 people about the podcast, share an episode that you found thought-provoking or a story that tugged at your heartstrings, and tell someone that you know about it. And honestly, I find that it's more effective to tell someone in person about the show, because we do get shadow banned when you try to share on social media. Anything containing the words cannabis or some other sort of illicit substance is going to get shadow banned by the social media platforms. So I find a better way to tell folks about the show is to tell them in person and then follow up by sending them a link or a text message with the address of the show on it. So in person is great. If you want to share on social media, we always appreciate that. If you've not done so already, you need to make sure you go out and subscribe to the podcast on your favorite podcast app, and that will automatically download each episode to your phone or device or whatever you're using to listen to the show. While you're out there subscribing, please give us a rating or review. And the reason I ask you to do this is because it boosts the algorithm. It tricks the podcast app into thinking we're more popular than we are. So if you give us a rating or review, it will actually recommend our show to other people saying, hey, you might find this podcast interesting because you listen to similar type shows. So give us a rating or review. And if you give us a review, I will be more than happy to read it on the air. While you're in the subscribing mood, go out and subscribe to our email newsletter list, cannabishealsme.com/subscribe. That will get you signed up for our email newsletter. I send out an email maybe once or twice a week, usually closer to once a week and maybe even sometimes less. But it gives us a way to contact you without having to worry about social media shadow banning us or pushing that down in your news feed. We can get directly in contact with you, but I promise I won't abuse it. You're not going to get spammed with 5,000 emails a week. You'll get 1 or 2 at the most each week, unless something urgent comes up. Our guest today is Marcus Wilson. He experienced a traumatic event while traveling overseas, and he developed PTSD as a result. He didn't want to go the traditional medication route, so he tried to self-medicate by drinking a lot, and that was not the greatest in the world for him, and so he discovered he could actually microdose cannabis and find relief from his PTSD symptoms. So Marcus is going to come on and talk to us about his story and then also tell us a little bit more about microdosing with cannabis. Marcus, welcome to the program.
Thank you so much for having me.
Absolutely. It's my pleasure. I had gotten an email from you. You'd reach out to me and said, hey, I've got a story and I'd love to tell it. And I really appreciate you doing that because I love getting feedback from folks to let us know how we're doing and that they think it's a good enough podcast that they actually want to come on it and share their stories. So thank you so much for reaching out.
My pleasure. You know, I was inspired by the podcast. I think it's important that those of us that have something to say or have experienced the benefit of this plant, you know, to kind of break that stigma and break that mold and not be afraid to kind of come out and speak about it publicly. So I appreciate the venue.
Well, absolutely. You are located in Vermont, correct?
That is correct.
But you're not originally from there, right?
No, I'm originally from Austin, Texas.
Oh, wow. Yeah, you're just, almost right down the road from me originally.
And
In
whereabouts are you?
Texas terms, anyway.
Yeah, that's right.
So tell us a little bit about your story and how you got involved in using cannabis medicinally.
Sure, sure. So, I start out the story is that I was a recreational user, like many in my early days. However, in the early 2000s, I was overseas living in Spain, and I suffered a traumatic experience while I was there. I was actually assaulted and robbed
Mm.
at knife point. And this was during my college years. And when I got back to Texas, I realized things weren't quite right with me. And sure enough, I was diagnosed with PTSD. And of course, at that time, it was the heydays of Prozac Nation. And that was the go-to first line of defense in order to rectify this. And it wasn't quite well studied at that point in time. Of course, I decided not to pursue the treatment. I wasn't a real big fan of Western medicine at that time, and I did not adhere to my therapy, so to speak. And I actually left my PTSD and any of the residual symptoms untreated for quite some time. And I say untreated for quite some time, but I actually started utilizing alcohol pretty heavily. That was my main go-to source to kind of cushion myself from the side effects of that post-traumatic stress. And so, unbeknownst to me, I thought with alcohol that I had essentially rectified everything. And then, fast forward many years. I stopped drinking, but the effects of that trauma were still present. And I was lucky enough to stumble upon Dr. Dustin Sulak and his microdosing schema, so to speak, and began putting it in my own life and started to research the endocannabinoid system, supplementation, utilizing microdosing of cannabis in a medicinal manner. And lo and behold, it worked. It was probably one of the best forms of therapy that I ever have come across. So I just took it from there and learned how to microdose, learned how it impacted me, studied how to actually cultivate cannabis in an efficient manner, and that brought me to where I am now, where I have a small business where I consult with medicinal patients. I'm a cannabis consultant and a grow coach, so to speak.
While you're dealing with the PTSD or not dealing with it, just trying to drink your problems away, did you ever consider, you mentioned that you're a recreational user. Mm-hmm. Did you use cannabis at that time? Did you notice that there were beneficial effects of it, or was it just mostly for, you thought at that point recreational use?
There is probably beneficial effects of the cannabis, but it was unbeknownst to me because I was mixing it so heavily with alcohol that it was all just kind of a daze for me. But now as I look at the usage of cannabis as medicine, it's two-factor. You've got that microdosing to supplement the endocannabinoid system, and then you have inhalation, that avenue, inhalation or any other method of taking cannabis in that allows you to get that full impact. It's very good for those acute symptoms and for the fast onset that you need if you're experiencing a major issue or a panic issue or any kind of an ailment such as that.
Now, for folks that aren't familiar with the term microdosing, can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so the whole idea of microdosing, and it's been dabbled in a variety of substances, but with cannabis, my microdosing regimen focuses on utilizing cannabis oil that I make out of MCT oil. And the whole idea or the philosophy of microdosing is that the idea is that you need to supplement the endocannabinoid system. So you have a natural endocannabinoid system, but for whatever reason, your body isn't quite producing what it needs. And so through microdosing, we're giving our body that supplementation, just like you would if you were supplementing a vitamin that you might be deficient in. Mm-hmm. So there's a variety of mechanisms of health benefits one can see from microdosing. When you start microdosing, it's important to kind of self-titrate that dose, to find that dose that brings you right to the point where you kind of feel it, but you don't necessarily exceed that. And then you just track those doses and you try to repeat and be adherent to that therapy to make sure that you're getting those cannabinoids.
Hey guys, wanted to tell you real quick about our podcast host and sponsor, Anchor.fm. If you're thinking about starting your own podcast, I highly recommend Anchor. It's free. There are creation tools that allow you to record and edit your podcast right from your phone or computer. They'll distribute your podcast for you so it can be heard on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and many more. And you can make money from your podcast with no minimum listenership. It's everything you need to make a podcast all in one place. Download the free Anchor app or go out to anchor.fm to get started. That's anchor.fm. Now back to the show. How long did it take for you to figure out kind of your sweet spot for your dosing?
It took some time. I was just kind of winging it at first. I still had that recreational mindset, and I wasn't really taking a very scientific approach like one would need to take when you're trying to take on health issues on your own. And mainly that's documentation and taking notes. So I would say, it took me a couple of months to even kind of get dialed in where I felt comfortable with my regimen. And some of that was, finding, consistent quality in the products that I was creating or sourcing. And others, it was creating a schedule and actually adhering to that schedule and saying, listen, I'm going to take this serious. Just like if I was receiving, a medical, treatment. That was potentially lethal. I needed to adhere to that, or blood pressure pills, for instance. Any kind of course of therapy. Treat cannabis the exact same way.
Now, you mentioned you're from Texas, so I'm assuming that you're probably started this journey while you were still in Texas, and then you've got the challenge of, like you mentioned previously, finding consistent quality or consistent product without knowing what kind of how much THC, CBD, the terpenes, all that is in the product that you're getting.
Yeah, and it's an unfortunate, because I know I'm fairly lucky to live in a state where they've destroyed the prohibitions against cannabis usage. Texas was definitely an interesting space to start practicing cannabis medicine in. I lived in a fairly open-minded city in Texas, but, just outside of Austin, we heard stories all the time of the local sheriffs pulling people over and, charging people with felonies for small amounts of cannabis.
Yeah. So,
it definitely reinforced that stigma and that fear. Hopefully things will change, but it definitely made it problematic to source cannabis. At that point in time, I wasn't growing my own cannabis purely out of fear. And the cannabis we were getting in that region was pretty poor quality. So
not everything's better in Texas, right? So did you move to Vermont in order to find better quality cannabis, or did you go somewhere else to kind of find a better quality?
Well, actually, I moved to Vermont for completely different reasons. It was for business, professional, educational reasons. But when I got here to Vermont, even though it was not legal at the time when I was here, it was a completely different culture surrounding cannabis. You didn't really have to fear that your neighbor would call the police on you if they smelled it. Mm-hmm. It was still available. I mean, there have been, growers here, like everywhere. There have been growers doing their thing despite whatever the legal environment might be. But I generally found the climate to be more welcoming for cannabis users. And it really set the stage for me to explore cannabis medicine without fear of repercussion or legal implications.
Yeah. Is that when you started growing it, is when you got to Vermont?
Yeah, I had dabbled a little bit in Texas, but when I really started taking things seriously, that was here in Vermont.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because if you grow it here in Texas, you run the risk of having additional felony charges put on you for, them accusing you of growing it to distribute it, and that takes it up to a whole nother level of charges.
Exactly.
You mentioned Dr. Dustin Sulak. How do you spell his last name, or do you know?
Yep, it's Sulak.
And did he write a book, or was there just some research that you ran across that he was doing?
Well, he has a website. It's healer.com. And he started out he's a DO, and he started out as a practicing physician in a small town in Maine. Uh-huh. Started integrating cannabis into his practice and started researching cannabis heavily. And he became what I feel is one of the preeminent cannabis physicians out there. And his healer.com site has just a wealth of information for anybody that's interested in cannabis medicine. And he also has a certification program that takes things a little deeper. So it was a huge step forward for me in my medicinal cannabis journey.
And he's kind of the one that set you on the path towards microdosing, right?
That is correct.
Okay. So you said you use like a MCT oil for the base, and then just kind of have like a set schedule that you take it on like you would any other sort of traditional medication?
Yeah. Yeah, I generally, and when I talk to patients that I work with, we establish a regimen that we actually place in Google Calendar so they can utilize it and be more adherent to their therapy. But that's correct. I utilize MCT oil just because I happen to like MCT oil on its own. It also has it's a great base oil for cannabis to reclaim as much of that THC as possible and other cannabinoids. So yeah, it's a great oil.
Well, when you meet with a potential client for the first time, what is kind of the process? How do you decide, where do you start? I guess you start low and go slow, right?
We do, and generally, the way that I run my practice, so it is cultivation instruction and medicinal cannabis coaching. And most of the clients that come to me, the whole idea here is that I want to get them on board with being able to grow their own medicine.
Uh-huh.
So be able to kind of reclaim that right you have as a human to make your own medicine, grow your own medicine, just as you would grow your own food. The practice that I use, we focus solely on autoflower cannabis. I find that's a great opportunity for both beginners and for medicinal cannabis consumers. So we go through the regimen on how to grow it, and what I feel is one of the most efficient, foolproof methods, if you will, out there. And then we begin to tailor the medicinal cannabis coaching. And that usually entails the whole process because we're finding the actual plants that work best and the various strains, if you will, that work best for what conditions they're looking to remedy or supplement. And we work that into their grow as well as their ultimate microdosing regimen. And we don't frown on any kind of inhalation or oral route. So, I work with patients. It's microdosing for the long term. And then, for instance, somebody like me who has PTSD, if you're, PTSD is notorious for causing people to have issues, sensory issues. So if I'm in a particular state of mind where I'm being triggered in that manner, I will pull out my vape pen,
Yeah.
and I'll go ahead and get that acute relief. So that's one of the great things about cannabis medicine.
So microdosing is more for long term, and then if you've got like kind of like sudden onset issues, then you can take a more direct route that addresses that immediate issue.
That's correct. And it's all based upon the length of time that those psychoactive compounds remain active within the individual. So when you're taking that oral route, the microdosing especially, you're finding the benefit sustained throughout the day, whereas inhalation, oftentimes will taper off after a couple of hours or so. So
that's good to be able to do both and combining them together.
Yeah, I found it's worked very well. It's worked very well. And, you don't have to be an advocate for any one method. So we kind of bring everything on board, the therapeutic as well as that recreational aspect, because it all works together.
And microdosing is a good way to supplement the endocannabinoid system without that feeling of being high. You get the benefits, but you don't necessarily get high, which is what a lot of people who've not used cannabis before, that's what they're worried about. Oh, I'm going to take this and I'm going to be high and stoned and be out of sorts.
Well, and that's right. And you have to think of the various stages too, of that initial high and then the come down effect as well of smoking cannabis, for instance. So even if you could medicate yourself in the morning, and you had your schedule planned out, you're still experiencing certain effects as you come down off of that initial high. And you're exactly spot on there with the microdosing program. You're not bringing yourself to the point where you're really feeling any psychoactive effects from your medicine, but behind the scenes, there's a whole host of beneficial activities going on. So that's one of the things we have to remember, is just because we're not feeling the high that we're accustomed to from cannabis, doesn't mean that it's not working in very prolific ways behind the scenes. So
Microdosing, it's kind of one of those areas that as people are learning more about the cannabis as medicine, it's gaining more traction, right?
I think it's this whole idea of cannabis as medicine. It's huge, and it's gaining traction, with a lot of the individuals that are new to cannabis medicine, especially those that have fear the stigma, or they're still indoctrinated by those stoner fear culture images that have been promulgated in the advertising space, and the government space, and the policy space. So for those that want to dip their toes, so to speak, into using cannabis as medicine, it is a perfect opportunity, and I'm seeing quite a few of those individuals coming on board.
Yeah, that seems like a good option for the boomer generation, which is one of the areas that it seems like the use of cannabis is growing. Microdosing seems like a good option for them because you don't have to worry about the getting stoned and that sort of thing.
Yeah, exactly. For anybody that has fear of being stoned or being out of control, it's amazing, because we need to look at this as a medicine with therapeutic benefit. The idea of getting stoned is a side effect, so to speak. So
yeah. But really with microdosing, you need to be in an area where you have access to a consistent product, right?
Yeah, in areas where you don't have legalization or medical licensing, it can be very problematic if you don't have any kind of any kind of an existing source or supply. So that is an issue. I know of many stories from people that are in states where it's prohibition still in effect, and they find workarounds, traveling to other states, etc. So
yeah, that's one of the, well, obviously, since you lived in Texas, that's one of the downsides to living in a state like this where prohibition, and they take it so stinking seriously, especially in small towns in East Texas.
Exactly. I have to really come back and feel the pain of those individuals that are struggling in areas like that, because when you move away from that environment, it all just becomes a figment of your of your distant past. But the struggle is real, and I think that's important to remember and to advocate for individuals in states. I think that it's really easy for those of us in states where they have removed prohibition to just move along life in a happy manner. But we need to remember that the battle, is still on, so to speak. And it's not until every state has some form of medical cannabis or legalization, we have to get to that point, and we have to advocate for those patients elsewhere. So
the bad thing is, it's the states where it's still illegal is, most of those, you can't just put something on the ballot and let the public vote on it. It's up to the legislature, and they move at a glacial pace. Coming around to the concept of cannabis as medicine, or the concept of self-ownership, and you shouldn't be telling adults what they can and can't put in their body.
It is truth. And being from Texas, that's something that I witnessed, and I'm sure you see every day the way that the government works there. It's a sad state of affairs. It definitely is.
The climate in Vermont, now they have a medical program, but they don't have rec right now, right? Am I remembering that correct?
That is correct.
Okay. But that's something that's been proposed.
We're told that it's coming online. We've had decriminalization, then we have a medical program, and then we have essentially what amounted to legalized cannabis that you could possess and grow on your own, but you obviously couldn't buy. So we're being told that that's coming on board as it continues to kind of navigate the various committees involved. Right now, the fear is, or the hang up now is the idea of corporate cannabis and kind of localized control. So that's really the state of affairs currently. But, for me, that's neither here nor there, because I exist within this space to allow people to work within the existing legal framework to grow their own medicine, to not be dependent upon having to put your name on a state list, to not have to be beholden to the pricing of corporate controlled cannabis. So that's that area. That's my main focus and priority.
Well, it's pretty intimidating, I think, for some folks to to think of taking on that task of growing their own medicine. You hear things about, oh, it's so easy, and then come to find out, no, it's really not that easy.
When I sit and say how easy cannabis growing can be, I sincerely mean it with the right system. So one of the ideas about cannabis is that we have to remember it still is encapsulated by a marketing apparatus that is hell-bent on making you think that you need every new gadget on this earth to grow cannabis. So it's really hard to fathom the money that is at stake, even when we don't have 50 state legalization. So when I started tinkering with cultivating my own cannabis, I wanted to get away from that. One other item I'll add is the cannabis cultivation space oftentimes is very egocentric, and it's all about, how much weight can we grow? Look at the size of this cola, et cetera. It becomes very braggadocious, if you will. I've taken a humble approach that focuses on a system that allows a medicinal patient to grow just what they need. Utilizing autoflower plants, it really makes the process a lot more streamlined. It reduces the amount of equipment you need. And so I'm essentially growing in a closet-sized space.
I was listening to another podcast you're on. You don't grow very many plants yourself. What, like
No.
3 or 4 at a time or something like that?
4 would be my max.
Okay.
And we have to think that's 4 autoflower plants. So we're possibly, roughly speaking, we're getting about 4 harvests a year, So for a medicinal patient, I'm not looking I'm not looking at cultivating a backlog of cannabis. And so for me, that's enough. But the process is scalable. So.
And microdosing is kind of a more cost-effective way to treat the body, correct?
I think so, because you're making an oil. It's very efficient to extract all the constituents that you need from the cannabis plant into that oil, and you're using very small amounts. So yeah, I would say it's very cost effective.
So a little bit of flour kind of goes a long way with that approach.
Oh, it does. It does. I'm to be honest, I'm one of the tinctures or oils that I use. I wouldn't always recommend this for everybody else, but I'm not as averse to having an oil that's been sitting around for around a year and it still has oil left in the bottle.
Oh wow!
And that's in addition to my regimen. So, and that's just because I've really focused on very low dose of that microdosing spectrum.
Yeah, because that's the biggest deterrent I think for a lot of people, even in states where it's legal, is the cost associated with what they're buying. The prices fluctuate with supply and demand, and so people are spending hundreds of, or even $1,000 a month on getting on their medicine.
And that state of affairs, to be honest, it breaks my heart, especially for patients.
Yeah.
That's something, it needs to be talked about more, is the price, is the amount of money that people are expending. This is natural medicine that should be cost effective. And that's why I think it's so great to grow. And that's my mission is to help people. So yeah, you're exactly right.
Because I spoke to a lady in Canada, and I don't know that they're allowed to home grow. I have a 2-second memory. Or maybe she's tried and she just wasn't successful in the past. But for her to get access to the medicine that she needs, it's costing her like $1,000 a month. And she's on a fixed income because she's disabled. And so the bulk of what she's spending is going towards medicine, which is a real shame.
It is a real shame. And I think it's important to mention, if it's an example in Canada, a lot of their cannabis medicine is partially sometimes subsidized by the government. So if you're thinking of the cost that they're still incurring in Canada, you can only imagine what that cost amounts to here in the United States with our, supposed market fluctuations of cannabis pricing at dispensaries. So,
but I understand it because the pricing in the legal side is driven because of the disadvantageous tax, 280E. So I kind of understand why folks have to charge so much, because if you can't charge enough to pay your taxes, you can't stay in business. Then you've got other states that see cannabis as a cash cow. And like, I think Illinois and California, they're charging like 40% sales or excise taxes on top of what people are paying for flour in the the dispensaries.
It's unbelievable. And the sad thing about it, and I apologize for this, this tirade here, but the
Oh,
sad
feel
thing
free.
about that is
That's
that
what we do a lot of times.
and these are states that would also, and I'm not coming out as supporting the pharma industry whatsoever, but these are also states that would penalize the pharma industry on the amount of money they're charging patients for their treatment, but yet they're willing to take cannabis medicine and make it just as expensive for patients.
Absolutely. I agree with that 1,000%. They talk out of both sides of their mouth.
It's the truth. It is the truth.
But it's okay if there's price gouging going on, as long as they're the ones doing it.
Right, exactly.
I really hadn't thought about that before, but I'm like, yeah, you're absolutely right. But they just see it like a cash cow and don't take into consideration that this is medicine for a lot of folks. And they may not want to jump through all the hoops that you have to jump through in order to be a patient.
Exactly. So it's very sad, and they're definitely not they're definitely not performing the role that they were allegedly elected to do in terms of helping the populace.
Yeah, and a lot of people are still having to go to the black market to get their product because they just can't afford it in the dispensaries because of the cost is higher, because these people are operating in the legal market. They've got to pay the federal and state income tax on it, and then you have to pay, if you go to the dispensary, you got to pay the government their pound of flesh as well.
It's true, and I harp on this, but whenever we passed our legalization, our first round legalization here in Vermont, a lot of people thought, wow, this is ridiculous. And it wasn't as well crafted of a law as it should have been. I understand, but given the time that they had to work with it and the hurdles that they had to leap over, to create this idea where it's, a certain amount is, legal to have as you traverse the outside the world outside of your home, the amount you can have inside your home, and then finally the amount of plants that you can grow. At first I thought, wow, this is kind of ludicrous. And then, for somebody like me that wants to utilize the cost-effective way to grow my own medicine, this is wonderful. To be honest, unless they change the law, I don't know that I would really step foot in a legal dispensary once that comes around. To be honest, maybe. I mean, there would be an opportunity to kind of see because there are pioneers in the industry that are doing some pretty amazing things that are only available on that scale. But yeah, it's, we're lucky to have opportunities to circumvent this market that they're creating.
Well, Marcus, if folks want to reach out to you or learn more about what you do, what is the best way for them to find you?
The best way is through my website. So it's cabercannabis.com. So it's CABER cannabis.com, or on Instagram, I'm at cabercannabis.
Well, I really appreciate you, like I said, reaching out to me and saying, hey, I'd love to come share my story and talking a little bit about microdosing. I think most people, when they think of taking cannabis as medicine, the default is to think, well, I have to smoke it. And so it's nice for folks to know that there are options other than smoking.
No, there are other options. And, I really just can't thank you enough for what you're doing by helping people to get their voice out there. It's probably one of the most important things we can do right now as we legitimize cannabis as medicine, is to have people share their stories. So I appreciate it.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. A story is what changed my mind. So I think it's an effective way to help people change and come around to cannabis as medicine. And then after they realize, yeah, there's medicinal benefits, maybe they'll think, it's really not any of my business what people put in their own body and in their own home.
Very true. Very true.
That's the goal anyway, is to hopefully walk people towards liberty, a little tiny baby step at a time.
I completely agree. And liberty is about being able to treat yourself on your own terms. So
100% amen. Well, I will put links to your website and then also your Instagram in the show notes for today's episode. Yeah, I really appreciate you reaching out and coming on and sharing your story. And I'm glad that you were able to find medicinal help with cannabis, and shifting from using alcohol as a medicine to using cannabis has probably got to be night and day.
Oh, totally. Thank you so much.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks a bunch, Marcus.
My pleasure.
Alrighty. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Show notes for today's episode can be found out at cannabis.com/97. We will be back here on Thursday with an educational episode. Professor CJ of the Dangerous History Podcast is going to join us, and we are going to talk about the most reviled man in Prohibition, Harry Anslinger. So you guys tune in on Thursday for that educational episode. Thanks a lot for listening. Y'all have a great week. Hit the subscribe button and you'll never miss an episode of the Cannabis Heals Me podcast. If you enjoyed today's show, please consider leaving us a 5-star rating on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, or whatever podcast app you're using. Do you have a suggestion for a guest on Cannabis Heals Me? Send an email to podcast@cannabishealsme.com. We'd love to hear from you. Please do not take any information from Cannabis Heals Me or its guests as medical advice. Contact your licensed physician before taking cannabis or using it for medical treatments.